Wind across the Kansas prairie carries the scent of dry earth and the distant metallic promise of a coming storm. Above the roof of a small, unpainted cabin, the sky stretches wide and indifferent. Inside, the air is heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the faint, sour tang of anxiety. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If these histories bring you comfort, you're always welcome to return by subscribing. You stand at the edge of your 160 acres in the early spring of 1872, the deed folded carefully in the inner pocket of your wool coat. The paper feels heavy against your chest, a tangible piece of the American dream that cost only a filing fee and the courage to leave everything behind. The land before you is an unbroken ocean of green and brown grasses, rippling like water under the relentless push of the wind. You step forward into the dense growth, your leather boots sinking slightly into the ancient, undisturbed sod. The sheer scale of the horizon is dizzying, offering nothing to stop the eye for miles in any direction. You breathe in the sharp, clean air of the plains, imagining the golden wheat that will soon replace the wild prairie. Beneath the surface of this endless grass lies a tangled, impenetrable mat of roots that has held the earth together for centuries. Raking this ground requires a specialized prairie plow, a heavy iron beast that demands the strength of a team of oxen to drag it through the stubborn dirt. Local merchants sell them, along with the harnesses, the seed, and the timber needed to frame a proper barn. These items form the essential architecture of survival, yet their combined costs can run from $300 to $1,000, an astronomical sum when a laboring man might earn barely $1 a day. Absolute necessity forces a silent, desperate calculation in the shadowed light of the general store. You sign the promissory note with a firm hand, watching the black ink settle into the rough paper. The merchant nods, his face impassive as he folds the contract and slips it into a wooden drawer behind the counter. You gather the supplies, loading the heavy iron plowshares and the canvas sacks of seed into the back of a rented wagon. The physical weight of the iron is nothing compared to the sudden, invisible weight of the interest rate attached to your signature, a brutal figure hovering between 10 and 20% annually. You drive the wagon back toward the claim as the sun begins its long descent, the wooden wheels groaning against the uneven dirt track. You know that before a single seed is pushed into the earth, a massive portion of its future harvest already belongs to someone else. You wake long before dawn, the absolute dark of the cabin pressing against your eyes. The air is bitterly cold, carrying the damp chill of late winter through the cracks in the hastily built timber walls. You pull on your stiff canvas trousers and walk out into the gray, pre-dawn silence to harness the oxen. The animals huff plumes of white steam into the freezing air, their massive heads lowering patiently as you secure the heavy leather yokes. You grasp the worn wooden handles of the plow, lean your weight forward, and begin the brutal work of tearing the prairie open. Metal tearing through sod creates a deep, agonizing rip that echoes across the empty landscape. Hour after hour, the iron blade fights the earth, turning over long, unbroken ribbons of black soil that glisten with moisture in the morning light. Dust rises in small clouds, settling into the lines of the farmer's face and coating the sweat on his arms. Physical work of this magnitude is agonizingly sluggish, a test of endurance that reduces the world to the space between the plow handles and the hindquarters of the oxen. By midday, the muscles in the back and shoulders burn with a fierce, continuous ache. Heat climbs high and hot, baking the newly exposed earth and drawing a rich, loamy smell into the air. This is the down payment of labor, the physical toll exacted by land that was promised to be free. You wipe the grit from your forehead with the back of a calloused hand, leaning against the plow for a brief moment of rest. The silence of the plains is absolute when the animals stop moving. a profound stillness that makes the ringing in your ears seem loud. You reach for the water jug wrapped in damp burlap, the liquid inside tepid and tasting faintly of clay. You drink deliberately, letting the moisture soothe your dry throat before turning your eyes back to the end of the long, ragged row. You tighten your grip on the handles, clicking your tongue to urge the team forward once again. You settle back into the rhythm of the work, losing yourself in the hypnotic, painful repetition of steps. You watch the green shoots of wheat break the surface of the black soil weeks later, a fragile miracle pushing up toward the spring sun. The sight of those tiny, ordered rows brings a sudden rush of pride, a fierce protective instinct over the life you have coaxed from the ground. You walk the perimeter of the field at dusk, checking the crude fencing meant to keep the wild animals at bay. You kneel to press the soil around a struggling stalk, your fingers tracing the delicate structure of the leaves. You imagine the granary filled to the rafters, calculating the precise mathematics of survival and debt repayment in the fading light. Summer arrives with a punishing, relentless heat that turns the sky a pale, hazy blue. Wind stops completely for days at a time, leaving the air thick and stagnant over the endless rows of maturing wheat. Thunderstorms occasionally roll across the horizon, massive bruised clouds flashing with internal light, bringing sudden deluges that threaten to flatten the stalks. Constant anxiety over weather becomes a physical sensation, a tight knot resting permanently in the stomach. Every morning brings a scan of the horizon, looking for the dark shapes of locust swarms or the ominous gray sheets of hail. Crops stand in the field like a fragile bank account, exposed to the whims of a completely indifferent sky. You step into the field in late July, the wheat now tall and heavy, brushing golden against your waist. You pull a single head of wheat from the stalk, crushing it between your palms to blow away the chaff and reveal the hard, dark kernels. You bite down on a kernel, feeling its firm resistance, the starch and life locked inside the tiny shell. You realize the harvest is ready, the moment of truth arriving in a wave of exhaustion and adrenaline. You sharpen the scythe by the light of a kerosene lantern that night, the rasp of the whetstone against steel singing a harsh, rhythmic melody. You know the next 2 weeks will be a blur of agonizing labor, a desperate race against time and weather to bring the crop indoors. You sleep fitfully, your dreams filled with the sound of falling grain and the ticking clock of the promissory note. You pause in the doorway of the granary weeks later, the air inside thick with the dusty, sweet smell of a successful harvest. The wooden bin is full, a mountain of grain representing hundreds of hours of sweat, blistered hands, and silent endurance. You trace your fingers through the cool, loose wheat, feeling the sheer volume of food you have managed to pull from the earth. You should feel a profound sense of security, the ancient comfort of a full storehouse standing between your family and the coming winter. You feel only a hollow, gnawing dread instead, because you know this mountain of grain does not truly belong to you. Legal contracts held by the bank and the ledger at the general store have already claimed every kernel sitting in the wooden bin. Grain is not sustenance, it is currency, a commodity bound by debts that must be transported, sold, and converted into cash to satisfy the creditors. Global markets dictate the price, a distant and invisible force that cares nothing for the backbreaking labor it took to grow the crop. Prices drop steadily, the abundance of the plains creating a glut that drives the value of a bushel lower with each passing season. Brutal mathematics reveal that even a perfect harvest might not generate enough cash to cover the compounding interest and the exorbitant railroad shipping rates. Such is the paradox of the American agricultural system, a mechanism perfectly designed to separate the producer from the product of their own labor. You walk back to the cabin under a canopy of brilliant cold stars, the isolation of the prairie feeling suddenly oppressive. You open the heavy wooden door, the hinges squeaking faintly, to find the one-room house illuminated by the meager glow of a single tallow candle. You see your wife sitting at the rough table, her hands busy mending a torn canvas sack, her face lined with an exhaustion that goes deeper than the bone. You sit heavily on the wooden bench, placing your calloused hands flat on the table, unable to meet her eyes. You listen to the quiet breathing of your children sleeping in the corner, a sound that usually brings peace, but tonight only sharpens the ache in your chest. You realize they are hungry, genuinely and persistently hungry, while sitting mere yards away from a building overflowing with food. You turn away from the thought of milling that wheat yourself, knowing taking collateral from the creditors is a crime that could cost you the farm. You must instead drive the wagon to town tomorrow, sell the wheat to the elevator operator at whatever price he dictates, and hand the cash directly to the banker. You will then walk across the dusty street to the general store and beg for another line of credit to buy a sack of refined flour. You will carry that purchased flour back to your starving family, knowing you have just traded your own abundant harvest for a fraction of its nutritional value and a deeper descent into debt. You feel the jaws of the trap closing tight, an invisible cage built of interest rates and monopolized transportation. You lean your head back against the rough timber wall and close your eyes, the scent of wood smoke filling your lungs. You let the darkness of the cabin wash over you, the stillness of the plains holding its ancient and different watch. Firelight in the hearth pops faintly, sending a single bright spark spiraling up into the dark chimney. Frost gathers outside as the wind begins to rise, brushing against the unpainted boards with a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh. Temperatures drop rapidly, the cold pressing against the window panes, demanding fuel and energy that is in desperately short supply. Nighttime on the frontier serves as a masterclass in isolation, a profound reminder of how far humanity is from any true safety net. Deads will still be there in the morning, waiting precisely where they were left, compounding silently in the dark. Seasons continue their rotation without mercy, dragging the homesteaders forward into another year of planting, hoping, and losing. You rise from the bench as the candle flame gutters and dies, plunging the small room into a thick, velvet blackness. You move by memory alone, stepping carefully past the wooden table and the iron stove still radiating a faint, dying heat. You slip off your heavy boots, setting them softly against the wall so as not to wake the children tucked beneath their scratchy wool blankets. You lie down on the straw-stuffed mattress, the rough fabric of the ticking pressing familiar patterns into your skin. You pull the quilt up to your chin, feeling the weight of the day settle deeply into your joints. You stare up at the invisible ceiling, listening to the rhythm of your wife's even breathing beside you. You trace the outline of the coming days in your mind, the endless list of tasks that stand between your family and absolute ruin. You calculate the cost of salt pork against the price of a new harness strap, the mental ledger endlessly balancing and unbalancing in the dark. You wonder if the men who sit in the fine, gaslit offices of the Eastern banks ever think about the lives attached to the numbers in their books. You doubt they do, knowing that distance is the greatest anesthetic against the reality of someone else's suffering. You turn onto your side, seeking some small comfort in the physical exhaustion that finally begins to pull you under. Dawn begins to trace the edges of the window frame, painting the glass with a cold and unfeeling gray. Outside, the prairie lies locked in frost, millions of delicate ice crystals clinging to the dormant stems of wild grass. Coyote calls echo from somewhere near the dry creek bed, a sharp, ragged sound that hangs lonely in the frigid air. Massive wooden elevators in the distant town wait for the wagons to arrive, towering monuments to the machinery of extraction. Railroad tracks stretch out toward the horizon, twin ribbons of steel that bind the isolated farms to a market they cannot control. Morning prepares to demand another day of labor, driven by the relentless necessity of survival. You open your eyes, the brief respite of sleep instantly shattered by the returning weight of obligation. You breathe in the cold air of the cabin, the smell of old ash and damp wool, grounding you in the immediate physical reality of your life. You throw back the quilt, the sudden chill, shocking your muscles into stiff, reluctant motion. You step onto the frozen dirt floor, your bare feet recoiling from the icy shock of the earth. You know exactly what must be done today, and you will do it, because enduring is the only resistance you have left. You step onto the wooden boardwalk of the frontier town, the uneven planks groaning softly beneath your heavy, mud-caked boots. The journey from the homestead has taken 3 hours, the oxen pulling the wagon at a punishingly slow pace under the pale spring sun. Dust coats the hem of your coat and settles deep into the creases of your face, a physical reminder of the endless dirt that defines your existence. You tie the exhausted animals to the hitching post outside the general store, wrapping the rough hemp rope around the weathered wood with practiced, efficient motions. A bell chimes sharply as you push open the heavy door, announcing your arrival to a room that holds the absolute power of life and death over your farm. The familiar anxiety tightens in your chest, a knot of dread that always accompanies the need to ask another man for the means to survive. Inside the dim mercantile, the air hangs thick and heavy with the combined overwhelming sense of raw leather, ground coffee, and the sharp bite of kerosene. Rows of wooden shelves stretch toward the low ceiling, packed tightly with the manufactured goods that a family cannot pull from the earth iron nails, glass jars, salt pork, and refined flour. The merchant stands behind the long wooden counter, a man who knows the exact financial breaking point of every farmer within a 20-mile radius. He does not smile as you approach, his eyes calculating and cold, reading the desperation etched into your posture before you even speak a word. This room is the true center of the agricultural trap, the place where the promise of free land goes to die in the pages of a leather-bound ledger. Every item on those shelves carries a hidden premium, a price inflated to extract the maximum possible value from men who have absolutely no alternative options. You watch the merchant pull the heavy ledger from beneath the counter, its pages worn soft and gray at the corners from years of recording rural poverty. He dips a steel-nibbed pen into a glass inkwell, the scratching sound loud and precise in the quiet room as he finds the page bearing your name. You ask for the seed wheat, the salt, and the canvas needed to repair the roof, your voice unnaturally tight as you list the barest necessities for the coming season. He tallies the figures with practiced speed, adding the exorbitant interest rate that will silently compound through the summer, the autumn, and the freezing winter. The numbers represent a mortgage on your future sweat, a legal claim on a crop that has not even been planted in the frozen ground yet. You nod your agreement because refusal means starvation, accepting the terms of a system designed to ensure you will never truly own the fruits of your own labor. Muted sunlight filters through the dusty front window, catching the dust motes dancing lazily above the scarred wooden counter as you sign the promissory note. The ink looks stark and permanent against the rough paper, binding you to a financial obligation that feels heavier than the iron plowshares you must push through the soil. You carry the burlap sacks of supplies out to the wagon, hoisting the heavy loads with muscles that ache from chronic, unrelenting overuse. This is the reality of the credit system. A cyclical nightmare where you borrow to plant to harvest, and harvest to pay the merchant who will force you to borrow again. There is no escape velocity from this economic gravity, only the grim determination to survive one more year and hope the distant commodity markets miraculously turn in your favor. You take the reins and urge the oxen forward, leaving the town behind and carrying your newly minted debt back to the isolated prairie. You drive your wagon past the massive wooden silhouette of the grain elevator, a towering monument to the middlemen who control the flow of wealth. The structure looms over the train tracks, its vertical lines harsh against the sky, swallowing the hard-won harvests of 1,000 desperate men. You remember standing in that shadow last autumn, listening to the operator quote, a price of 95 cents a bushel for wheat you knew was worth far more on the global exchange. He had looked at you with absolute indifference, knowing perfectly well you could not afford to transport the grain yourself to seek a better buyer. The information asymmetry was a weapon used with devastating precision, separating you from your profit while legally maintaining the illusion of a voluntary free market transaction. The elevator operator grew rich on the margins of your exhaustion, building a comfortable life on the difference between what your crop was worth and what your desperation forced you to accept. Heavy black smoke chugs from a locomotive stack down the line, a terrifying iron behemoth hissing steam and radiating waves of suffocating heat across the rails. The railroad companies hold a complete and unbreakable monopoly over the region, dictating freight rates that devour 30 to 40% of the crop's total value. Farmers in the West are utterly dependent on these steel arteries to move their bulk commodities, a vulnerability the railroad barons exploit with ruthless, calculating efficiency. Rate manipulation is a common tactic, keeping prices low during the harvest to lure the grain, then skyrocketing the cost during the off-season when farmers face emergencies. You watch the train cars couple together with a violent metallic crash, knowing that the wealth of the plains is being funneled directly into the pockets of distant stockholders. The law offers no protection, the politicians are bought with railroad money, and the farmer is left to absorb the losses while continuing to work the earth. You climb down into the root cellar beneath the floorboards weeks later, holding a flickering tallow candle against the oppressive, earthy dampness of the spring-hungry gap. Late winter has exhausted the inadequate stores of preserved food, leaving the shelves terrifyingly bare as the planting season begins to demand massive expenditures of physical energy. You inspect the remaining wooden barrels, finding only a few soft sprouting potatoes and a meager scraping of flour that must somehow stretch across another month. The smell of the cellar is the smell of failure, a damp, musty reminder that your best efforts were not enough to secure true abundance for your family. You select 3 potatoes, brushing the dirt from their wrinkled skins, knowing this insufficient starch will be the entirety of the evening meal. You climb back up the wooden ladder, the cold draft from the cabin hitting your face, carrying the weight of a father who cannot adequately provide. Hunger becomes a constant, quiet companion in the small house, a dull ache that never completely fades from the hollow spaces beneath your ribs. Children move with less energy during these lean months, their laughter muted, their faces pale and pinched from a diet lacking in essential vitamins and proteins. The daily reality of malnutrition is not dramatic starvation, but a slow, grinding depletion of the body's reserves, leaving everyone vulnerable to the slightest infection or illness. Work in the fields cannot stop for weakness. The soil must be turned, the seeds must be sown, and the grueling physical labor must be executed on empty stomachs. Dizziness washes over you in the mid-afternoon sun, a nauseating wave of exhaustion that you must simply endure while gripping the plow handles tighter. The system demands productivity regardless of human suffering, extracting maximum effort while providing minimum sustenance to the people who actually generate the nation's wealth. You notice your wife serving the evening meal, quietly dividing the meager portions and placing absolutely nothing on her own chipped wooden plate. She claims she is not hungry, a gentle lie spoken to protect the pride of the household and ensure the children consume the few available calories. The historical record is built on the silent, unrecorded sacrifices of farm women who consistently absorbed the worst impacts of the agricultural crisis to shield their families. She works from before dawn until long past dark, washing clothes by hand, hauling water, tending the garden, and fighting a desperate losing battle against the encroaching poverty. Her body bears the toll of this relentless labor and chronic undernutrition, her frame growing thinner, her eyes carrying a deep, permanent exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. You eat your portion in silence, the food tasting like ash in your mouth, overwhelmed by the profound injustice of a system that starves the people who feed the world. Green shoots finally break the dark earth in May, a vibrant blanket of hope that pushes up through the soil and seems to promise an end to the lean season. The wheat grows tall and strong through June, fueled by timely rains and the deep, untapped fertility of the prairie dirt, offering a vision of pure abundance. You walk the rows in early July of 1874, admiring the heavy golden heads of grain that represent the most spectacular crop you have ever managed to cultivate. Calculations begin again in your mind, the desperate hope that this unprecedented yield will finally be enough to clear the merchant's ledger and pay down the bank's mortgage. The stalks brush against your waist, a tangible manifestation of your labor, rustling softly in the warm summer wind like a promise of future security. For a few brief, beautiful weeks, you allow yourself to believe that the American dream might actually be real, that hard work will eventually be rewarded with stability. You freeze in the middle of the field on a Tuesday afternoon, your eyes drawn to a strange, shimmering haze gathering high above the western horizon. The sky takes on an unnatural, brassy tint, the sunlight filtering through the approaching mass in a way that casts long, eerie shadows across the golden wheat. The wind dies completely, leaving a suffocating stillness that makes the hairs on your arms stand up in primal, unexplainable terror. You shade your eyes with a dirt-stained hand, straining to comprehend the sheer scale of the dark cloud that is moving rapidly against the upper air currents. This is no thunderstorm. There is no smell of ozone, no rumble of thunder, only a vast, terrifying silence that precedes the arrival of a biblical catastrophe. You realize with a sudden, dropping sensation in your gut that the horizon itself is alive, a moving, devouring force descending upon the vulnerable plains. Sound drops from the sky like a physical weight, a low, vibrating hum that grows steadily into the deafening roar of millions of papery wings beating the air. The Rocky Mountain locust swarm eclipses the sun, plunging the mid-afternoon farm into an eerie, twilight darkness filled with the chaotic swirling of countless insects. They begin to fall like a heavy, unnatural snow, striking your hat, your shoulders, and the ground with a soft, relentless pattering that quickly becomes a nightmare. Millions of tiny jaws begin to chew simultaneously, creating a sickening, crackling noise that sounds exactly like a wildfire ripping through dry, brittle brush. The insects cover every available surface, a living, crawling carpet of devastating hunger that immediately begins to dismantle months of your agonizing labor. There is no defense against this sheer biological mass, no weapon or tool that can stop the systematic consumption of your entire livelihood. You pull your collar up and run frantically toward the cabin, the locusts crunching sickeningly beneath your boots with every panic step you take. You burst through the wooden door, slamming it shut behind you to find your wife and children huddled in the center of the room, their eyes wide with fear. The sound of the swarm chewing against the wooden walls and the glass window panes is deafening, a mechanical, scraping horror that vibrates through the very timber of the house. You stand at the window, utterly paralyzed, watching the absolute destruction of your crop unfold in a matter of hours, the tall wheat stalks vanishing into the writhing mass. The insects eat the leaves from the trees, the vegetables from the garden, the wooden handles of the tools left outside, and even the clothes hanging on the washing line. You realize that your perfect harvest, your ticket out of debt, is being converted into insect biomass right before your eyes, and you are entirely powerless to stop it. Silence returns to the prairie by nightfall, a devastating, empty quiet that replaces the roar of the swarm as the locusts finally move on to the next doomed county. You step outside into the moonlight, the landscape unrecognizable, completely stripped of vegetation and reduced to a barren, chewed-up wasteland of bare stalks and dirt. The smell of the insects lingers in the air, a foul, acrid odor that mixes with the scent of the broken, bleeding plants left behind in the dirt. The destruction is total and uncompromising, an act of God that has wiped out a year of labor, extinguished all hope of profit, and guaranteed another brutal season of the hungry gap. The bank will not care that the locusts came. the merchant will still demand payment for the seed that was eaten, and the railroad will simply adjust its rates for the farmers who survived. You are left standing in the ruins of your own effort, fully comprehending the fragile, merciless nature of agricultural survival on the American frontier. You stare out at the ruined fields, the cold realization settling over you that the government will offer absolutely no assistance in the wake of this catastrophe. The prevailing political ideology of laissez-faire capitalism dictates that intervention would weaken your moral character, framing your ruined crop not as a tragedy, but as a test of self-reliance. Newspapers in the East will print stories of the plague, but the politicians will refuse to issue relief funds, arguing that the market must be allowed to correct itself without interference. You are expected to simply absorb the loss, to find a way to borrow more money against land that is now worthless, and to begin the cycle of debt all over again. The profound cruelty of this indifference is the final crushing blow, a clear message that the system values the ideological purity of the market far above the actual lives of the citizens. You turn your back on the empty fields and walk slowly back toward the dark cabin, knowing that tomorrow you must somehow look your children in the eyes and tell them there is nothing left to eat. You stand in the barren field the next morning, the dry earth offering no answers to the terrifying mathematics of your survival. The ruined wheat crop means you cannot afford the specialized seed for next season, forcing a desperate pivot to a different kind of harvest. Corn emerges as the only viable option, a crop that promises high yields and multiple uses for a family teetering on the absolute edge of starvation. You know the local merchants push this specific commodity, knowing it ties the entire region into a predictable, exploitable agricultural rhythm. The decision to specialize feels less like a choice and more like a mandate from the men who hold the mortgages and control the ledgers. Monoculture takes root not out of agricultural wisdom, but out of sheer inescapable economic necessity. Dust drifts across the empty acres, carrying the bitter memory of the locust swarm into the fading autumn light. The land must be prepared again, demanding another massive investment of physical energy from a body that has not fully recovered from the summer's trauma. Neighbors down the lane are making the identical calculation, turning their ruined fields over in preparation for the great corn gamble. Everyone believes that specializing will bring efficiency, a rational economic response to a system that ruthlessly punishes any deviation from the cash crop model. Nobody understands that planting the same crop simultaneously across millions of acres will inevitably trigger a catastrophic collapse in global commodity prices. You walk into the general store with a heavy heart, preparing to leverage the very last ounce of equity you hold in the homestead. The merchant watches you approach the wooden counter, his expression a mask of calculated indifference as he opens the massive, leather-bound account book. You request the seed corn and the essential supplies to survive the winter, fully aware that this new debt will carry an even more punishing interest rate. He writes the figures down with a sharp steel pen, the scratching sound amplifying the deep, silent panic building in your throat. The credit is extended, but it comes wrapped in invisible chains that bind your future labor strictly to the cultivation of the single, mandated crop. You leave the store owing more money than your farm has ever produced in a single year. You pull the plow through the stubborn dirt the following spring, the oxen leaning heavily into their leather yokes under the pale April sun. Every step feels heavier this year, the cumulative toll of chronic malnutrition and constant stress settling permanently into the muscles of your lower back. The furrows open behind you dark and straight, ready to receive the bright yellow kernels that represent your absolute last chance at financial redemption. You drop the seeds carefully, covering them with a sweep of your worn boot, whispering a silent, desperate prayer for rain and a fair market. The work consumes every waking hour, leaving no time or energy to maintain a vegetable garden or hunt for supplementary food in the distant timber stands. Survival becomes entirely dependent on the success of this single, sprawling monoculture. Silence settles over the plains during the long, hot afternoons, broken only by the dry rustle of the growing corn stalks shifting in the breeze. The plants rise rapidly, their broad green leaves drinking in the sunlight and transforming the empty prairie into a dense, towering forest of agriculture. It looks like spectacular abundance, a visual triumph of human will over the harsh realities of the untamed frontier environment. Beneath the surface, however, the relentless cultivation of corn is systematically destroying the complex, delicate chemistry of the native soil. Nitrogen is being pulled from the earth at an unsustainable rate, leaving the dirt exhausted and brittle with each passing week. The visual promise of wealth hides a microscopic devastation that will soon demand its own expensive remedy. You kneel in the dirt midway through the growing season, noticing a pale, sickly yellow tinge creeping along the edges of the lower leaves. The realization hits you like a physical blow. The soil is failing, exhausted by the demands of a crop it was never meant to sustain indefinitely. You know the only solution is commercial fertilizer, an expensive chemical powder sold by the exact same men who will eventually purchase your harvest at a steep discount. You must borrow again to buy the inputs necessary to keep the crop alive, adding yet another layer of debt to an already impossible burden. The trap tightens beautifully for the merchant, allowing him to squeeze profit from your desperate need to simply maintain the basic productivity of your own land. You spread the harsh-smelling powder across the rows, literally sinking borrowed money into the dying ground. You swing the heavy harvesting knife through the thick stalks in early autumn, the air filled with the sharp, dusty scent of dried corn. The yield is massive, a physical mountain of grain that requires weeks of grueling, relentless labor to cut, gather, and transport to the wooden storage bins. Your hands are blistered and bleeding, the rough husks slicing through callus built up over years of punishing agricultural work. You look at the overflowing granary and feel a brief, desperate surge of hope, believing that this sheer volume must surely translate into financial security. You forget that millions of other desperate men have just produced the exact same mountain of corn, flooding the regional elevators and completely obliterating the market price. The reward for your unprecedented productivity will be pennies on the bushel. Wooden planks of the root cellar groan under the shifting weight of the earth above, a dark and inadequate sanctuary for the family's winter provisions. Proper preservation requires specialized equipment, glass canning jars, and coarse salt, all of which cost cash that simply does not exist in the household ledger. You attempt to store the excess vegetables and a portion of the corn harvest in the damp, poorly ventilated space beneath the floorboards. Temperature fluctuations and seeping moisture begin their invisible work almost immediately, creating the perfect, deadly conditions for rot and bacterial growth. The lack of proper infrastructure transforms the autumn abundance into a ticking clock of spoilage, guaranteeing that much of this hard-won food will never reach the dinner table. Poverty ensures that even a successful harvest cannot guarantee a secure winter. You lift the heavy trapdoor weeks later, instantly assaulted by the sweet, sickening stench of rotting root vegetables and moldering grain. You climb down the crude ladder, holding a flickering candle that illuminates the fuzzy gray destruction creeping across your carefully stored supplies. The potatoes have turned to foul-smelling mush, and the corn designated for the family's winter meals is thickly coated in a dangerous, toxic mold. You frantically sort through the bins, trying to salvage anything edible, your hands covered in the slimy residue of agricultural failure. You realize with a cold, absolute certainty that your family will face the hungry gap much earlier this year, stripped of their reserves by inadequate storage. The cruelty of watching your own food rot while your children face starvation is a unique, soul-crushing agony. You haul the ruined provisions out into the freezing winter air, dumping them into the distant tree line where even the wild scavengers hesitate to touch them. The family diet immediately contracts to a brutal, monotonous routine of ground cornmeal, boiled in water to create a thin, tasteless porridge. There is no meat, no dairy, no preserved fruit to provide the essential vitamins the human body desperately requires to maintain its basic functions. You eat the same gray gruel morning and night, the heavy starch filling the stomach but leaving the muscles weak and the mind strangely clouded. This is the reality of specialized commercial farming, forcing the producer to consume an unbalanced, dangerous diet while their high-value crops are shipped off to distant, wealthier markets. The farm produces calories, but it utterly fails to produce actual nutrition. Winter drags on with merciless indifference, the bitter winds howling across the flat expanse and forcing the family to huddle continuously around the iron stove. The lack of dietary diversity begins to manifest in subtle, terrifying ways, starting with a profound, unshakable lethargy that grips the entire household. You notice your youngest daughter sitting quietly in the corner for hours, her usual bright energy replaced by a dull, hollow-eyed exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. Her skin looks pale and thin, the natural resilience of childhood stripped away by months of surviving entirely on a single nutrient-deficient grain. Nobody in the isolated rural community understands the complex science of vitamins. They only know that the long winters always bring a mysterious, creeping sickness. The monoculture diet is slowly shutting down their bodies from the inside out. You roll up your son's homespun sleeve one evening, discovering a thick, scaly rash spreading aggressively across his thin forearms and the back of his neck. The skin is inflamed and cracking, resembling a severe sunburn, despite the fact that he has not been outside in the direct light for weeks. You apply a useless salve made of rendered animal fat, completely unaware that you are witnessing the classic initial symptom of pellagra. The disease is caused entirely by a lack of niacin in the corn-heavy diet, a nutritional deficiency that will systematically destroy the digestive system and the brain if left untreated. You watch the rash worsen day by day, attributing the affliction to bad air or God's will, entirely ignorant of the fact that a simple bowl of mixed vegetables could cure him. The economic system has effectively mandated this suffering. You listen to the terrifying sounds of severe diarrhea echoing from the children's bedroll, the second devastating phase of the nutritional disease taking hold. The onus strips away whatever tiny reserves of fat and muscle they have left, leaving them dangerously dehydrated and agonizingly weak. You and your wife take turns staying awake, offering sips of tepid water and whispering useless, desperate comforts into the dark, freezing cabin. The sheer isolation of the frontier means there is no doctor to call, no medicine to purchase, and no neighbors close enough to offer any meaningful assistance in the middle of the night. You are completely alone with a terror you cannot understand, and an illness you have no weapons to fight. The promised independence of the homesteader has become a death sentence of absolute, unbroken solitude. Desperation drives you to try boiling the moldy, salvaged corn from the ruined root cellar, hoping that the cooking fire will somehow purify the toxic grain. The resulting meal is bitter and dangerous, introducing entirely new toxins into bodies that are already failing from profound malnutrition. The immune systems of the entire family are severely compromised, leaving them utterly defenseless against the secondary infections that sweep through the drafty, unsanitary cabin. A simple winter cold rapidly develops into deep, rattling pneumonia in your wife's chest, her breathing becoming shallow and wet as the days blur into a nightmare of fever and helplessness. You wipe her burning forehead with a damp cloth, realizing that the poverty enforced by the agricultural markets is literally killing the woman you love. The math of the ledger has finally translated into the mathematics of mortality. You dig the small grave in the frozen earth behind the cabin, the iron spade ringing sharply against the ice-hardened prairie dirt. The physical labor of burying your own child requires a detachment so profound it feels like a permanent fracturing of your own soul. You wrap the tiny body in a worn wool blanket, lowering it into the dark ground without the comfort of a priest, a congregation, or a proper wooden coffin. You stand over the mound of turned earth. the freezing wind tearing at your coat, wondering how a nation built on the promise of abundance can demand such a horrific price from its citizens. The Homestead Act offered land, but it provided absolutely no infrastructure for survival, abandoning the most vulnerable families to the merciless forces of disease and starvation. You walk back to the silent house, leaving a piece of yourself permanently in the cold ground. You drive the wagon into town weeks later, the spring thaw turning the dirt roads into a thick, treacherous mud that threatens to snap the oxen's legs. The purpose of the journey is to settle the accounts from the previous year, to finally discover what your massive, grueling corn harvest is actually worth on the open market. The grain elevator operator offers a price so insultingly low it barely covers the cost of the expensive fertilizer you were forced to purchase to grow it. You argue, your voice cracking with an uncharacteristic, raw desperation, but the man behind the glass window simply shrugs and points to the posted global commodity rates. You are forced to accept the catastrophic loss, converting your year of agonizing labor and personal tragedy into a handful of worthless paper notes. The system functions perfectly, extracting your wealth without violating a single law. Heavy steps carry you across the muddy street toward the general store, the paper money burning a shameful hole in your coat pocket. The merchant is waiting with the ledger already open, fully anticipating the arrival of the desperate farmers seeking to clear their names. You place the cash on the scarred wooden counter, watching his eyes scan the insufficient amount before making a sharp, dismissive notation in the book. He informs you that the harvest did not even cover the accumulated interest on the seed, the tools, and the meager winter supplies, leaving the principal debt entirely untouched. You realize with a sickening clarity that you have worked for an entire year, lost a child to malnutrition, and ended up deeper in debt than the day you signed the original note. This is the precise mechanics of debt peonage, an invisible, inescapable slavery bound by legal contracts rather than iron chains. You stare at the merchant's impassive face, a dangerous, white-hot anger flaring briefly in the hollow space behind your ribs. You want to reach across the counter to demand justice for the rigged markets, the extortionate railroad raids, and the silent, grinding starvation that defines your existence. You do nothing, because any act of rebellion will instantly cut off the line of credit you absolutely require to purchase the seed for the upcoming spring planting. The threat of total starvation keeps you docile, forcing you to swallow your rage and politely ask the man who is ruining you for another advance. He agrees, adding another layer of compound interest to your account, securing his profit for the next 12 months, regardless of the weather or the yield. You walk out of the store a broken man, entirely owned by the men who control the capital. You notice the sharp, unmistakable smell of cheap corn whiskey drifting from the alleyway beside the livery stable, a scent that promises a temporary fiery oblivion. Despair of this magnitude requires medication, a way to silence the endless, panicked calculations and the crushing memory of the small grave behind the cabin. You turn down the narrow passage, exchanging a few copper coins for a cloudy glass jar filled with harsh, locally distilled alcohol. The liquor burns like poison going down your throat, a crude, violent heat that momentarily numbs the cold terror living in your stomach. This is how the rural poor survive the psychological trauma of an unwinnable game, relying on the very crop that bankrupted them to briefly blur the edges of their misery. You drink until the wooden walls of the town begin to spin, leaning heavily against the damp brick. Footsteps splash through the mud as other farmers gather in the shadows, passing jars of the cheap liquor and speaking in low, defeated voices. Every man in the alley shares the identical story of compounding debt, useless abundance, and the slow, inevitable loss of their independence to the eastern banks. The whiskey fuels a dark, resentful camaraderie, a shared understanding that hard work has been completely divorced from financial reward in this new industrialized American economy. They talk of the railroad stealing their freight, the merchants inflating the prices, and the politicians in Washington who refuse to intervene while the heartland bleeds. The alcohol provides no real answers, only a few hours of artificial courage before the crushing reality of the morning demands their return to the fields. The cycle of self-medication becomes just another trap, draining away the tiny fragments of cash that manage to escape the merchant's ledger. You wake the next morning in the back of your own wagon, the rising sun hammering a brutal, throbbing ache into your temples. The smell of stale whiskey and wet wool surrounds you, a physical manifestation of your own temporary surrender to the hopelessness of the frontier. You sit up slowly, your joints aching, looking out over the vast, indifferent expanse of the prairie that stretches endlessly toward the horizon. The land remains unchanged, utterly uncaring about the complex financial webs and the deep human tragedies playing out across its surface. You gather the leather reins in your trembling hands, clicking your dry tongue to wake the resting oxen for the long, punishing journey back to the homestead. You know you must return to the plow, to the dying soil, and to the surviving members of your family who are entirely dependent on your continuing labor. You arrive back at the cabin as the afternoon light begins to turn the pale sky a deep, bruised purple. The unpainted timber walls look smaller and more fragile than you remember, a tiny, insignificant speck lost in the overwhelming scale of the Great Plains. You unhitch the animals in silence, the routine tasks requiring no thought, allowing your mind to drift back to the grim realities of the ledger book. You understand now, with a terrible absolute clarity, that the Homestead Act was never a promise of prosperity. It was an invitation to serve as the expendable labor force for a rapidly expanding empire of capital. You are the engine of wealth for the merchants, the railroads, and the bankers, while you and your children are systematically denied the right to consume the fruits of your own grueling labor. You push open the heavy door, stepping back into the dark, ready to begin the cycle all over again. Morning arrives with the distant, mournful whistle of a train, a sound that no longer represents progress or connection to the wider world. The locomotive is a symbol of the monopoly that dictates your survival, a machine that extracts the grain and leaves only poverty in its wake. You sharpen the iron plow blade on the heavy, grinding stone, the harsh, screeching noise echoing across the empty yard. The new seed corn sits in canvas sacks by the door, purchased on credit, representing another year of dangerous monoculture that will further deplete the already exhausted earth. You look out at the fields, knowing they will demand every ounce of your strength, your health, and your hope over the coming months. The system is perfectly designed to run indefinitely on the fuel of your quiet, unrecorded desperation. You brace your boots against the pactor and push the plow forward into the new season, the muscles in your back screaming in protest. The soil turns over, dark and moist, ready to accept the seeds that will lock you into another cycle of the hungry gap and the usurious interest rates. You no longer look at the horizon with dreams of building wealth or securing a grand future for your children. You look at the dirt simply trying to calculate how many days of survival you can extract from the next harvest before the creditors arrive to claim their share. The American frontier has closed its doors on the myth of the independent yeoman farmer, replacing it with the brutal reality of industrial agriculture. You lower your head, grip the wooden handles, and force yourself to take another step into the unforgiving earth. You watch the horizon for rain through the brutal, relentless summer of the 1880s, but the sky offers only a flat, blinding dome of pale blue heat. The drought settles over the Great Plains not as a sudden disaster, but as a slow, agonizing suffocation that drains the life from the soil day by day. Dust devils dance across the parched fields, twisting columns of dry topsoil that scatter the remnants of your exhausted crops into the indifferent wind. The prairie grasses that once survived these dry cycles have been eradicated by your plow. leaving the naked earth completely defenseless against the baking sun. You kick at the dirt with the toe of your boot, watching it shatter into a fine gray powder that offers absolutely no moisture to the dying roots of your corn. The environmental gamble of mass agricultural settlement is failing spectacularly, exposing the fragile reality of a region pushed past its natural limits by the demands of commercial farming. Silence replaces the usual summer chorus of insects and birds, a profound and terrifying quiet that underscores the absolute absence of water on the homestead. The creek bed behind the tree line has cracked into a mosaic of dry, curling mud flakes, forcing you to rely entirely on the hand-dug well near the cabin. You lower the wooden bucket deeper each morning, listening to the rope scrape against the stone lining until it finally hits the shrinking, muddy puddle at the very bottom. The water you haul up is thick with silt and tastes faintly of alkaline minerals, a bitter draught that barely moistens the cracked lips of your exhausted children. Animals suffer terribly in the heat, the oxen standing with their heads lowered in the meager shade of the barn, their ribs showing starkly beneath their dull, dusty hides. The fundamental requirements for biological survival are vanishing, revealing the terrifying vulnerability of a family completely isolated from any functioning social safety net. You hold the stiff, formally written letter in your trembling hands, the Eastern postmark staring back at you like a sentence of execution delivered through the mail. The local bank has sold your compounding, unpayable mortgage to a distant speculator, a man who has absolutely no interest in your survival or the agricultural potential of your land. He has officially called the note, demanding immediate payment in full for a principal amount that has swollen grotesquely under years of usurious, unregulated interest rates. There is no crop to sell, no collateral left to leverage, and no neighbor with the financial capacity to offer a desperately needed emergency loan. The legal machinery of the United States government, which enthusiastically granted you this land, now prepares to strip it away with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. You fold the letter carefully and place it on the wooden table, the paper feeling heavier than the iron plow that originally broke the sod. Shadows lengthen across the bare floorboards of the cabin as the sheriff's wagon finally arrives to execute the foreclosure order on a stifling Tuesday afternoon. The process is remarkably quiet, devoid of any dramatic confrontation, consisting only of a few signed documents and the systematic transfer of your entire life's work to a corporate ledger. You stand in the dusty yard and watch the lawmen inventory the barn, the well, and the fencing you built with your own bleeding hands over a decade of backbreaking labor. The profound ambiguity of property ownership is fully exposed. The deed had your name on it, but the bank always owned your future, your harvests, and ultimately the dirt beneath your boots. The men tip their hats with a polite, uncomfortable formality before driving away, leaving you as a trespasser on the exact same acres you homesteaded. The dream of the independent, land-owning pioneer is officially dead, replaced by the crushing reality of total dispossession. You sign the new, degrading contract by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp, agreeing to remain on the property not as an owner, but as a tenant farmer. The speculator who now holds the deed realizes that empty land generates no profit, so he graciously allows you to continue working the exhausted soil in exchange for a massive share of the eventual crop. The terms dictate that you must provide the labor, the tools, and the seed, while the landlord claims the lion's share of the harvests simply for holding the legal title. You read the clauses that explicitly forbid you from planting a vegetable garden or raising livestock for your family's consumption, mandating that every square inch of dirt be dedicated to the cash crop. The pen scratches across the rough paper, binding you to a system of debt peonage that mirrors the brutal sharecropping regimes currently strangling the post-war South. You have traded a mortgage you could not pay for a tenancy you cannot escape. Morning light reveals the psychological devastation of your new status, a subtle but profound shift in how you view the weathered timber cabin and the surrounding fields. There is no longer any incentive to improve the property, to repair the sagging roof, or to carefully rotate crops to preserve the fragile nitrogen balance in the soil. Any investment of your time or money will simply enrich the distant landlord who retains the legal right to evict you at the end of the season without a single penny of compensation. You walk past the broken fence rail near the pasture, choosing to leave it rotting in the grass because the pride of ownership has been entirely extinguished from your chest. The land becomes nothing more than a temporary extraction site, an adversarial environment where you must squeeze enough calories to survive before the owner claims his disproportionate cut. You pick up the hoe and head toward the fields, working not for your family's future, but for the profit margins of a man you have never even met. Your wife bears the invisible, crushing weight of this transition with a quiet, stoic despair that deepens the lines around her exhausted eyes. The domestic sphere she manages requires constant, grueling physical exertion, from hauling the silty water to boiling laundry over an open fire in the punishing summer heat. Her crucial labor sustains the entire agricultural operation, yet she holds absolutely no legal power, no property rights, and no voice in the catastrophic financial decisions that have ruined the family. She attempts to stretch the meager, unappetizing rations of purchased cornmeal, sacrificing her own portion so the men and boys have enough calories to continue the heavy outside work. You notice her leaning heavily against the doorframe in the late afternoons, her body weakened by chronic malnutrition and the relentless, unpaid demands of rural womanhood. The system extracts her life force just as efficiently as it extracts the nutrients from the soil, offering nothing but premature aging and quiet suffering in return. You stand before the merchant in the general store, the familiar humiliation washing over you as you ask to open a new line of credit under the tenant-furnished system. The storekeeper knows your land was foreclosed, adjusting his already extortionate interest rates upward to account for the increased risk of lending to a newly dispossessed farmer. He writes your requested supplies into the ledger, fully aware that this debt will be deducted directly from your meager share of the crop before you ever see a single paper dollar. The prices charged for this essential credit are massively inflated, a hidden tax levied against poverty that ensures the mathematical impossibility of ever paying the balance in full. You accept the sack of poor quality flour and the small tin of salt, understanding that you are functionally borrowing your own future starvation. You walk out into the dusty street, a free American citizen reduced to the practical equivalent of a medieval serf bound to the local mercantile. Distant echoes of similar tragedies play out across the vast cotton-growing regions of the South, where the sharecropping system operates with an even more explicit racialized cruelty. Formerly enslaved people and impoverished white families are locked into ironclad contracts by plantation owners who control the land, the seed, the tools, and the only store within walking distance. The Southern landlords dictate the price of the harvest and the costs of the supplies, performing the final accounting behind closed doors to ensure the tenant always finishes the year owing more money. Laws actually prohibit these laborers from leaving the plantation if they carry a debt, effectively criminalizing poverty and criminalizing any attempt to seek better working conditions elsewhere. The underlying economic machinery is identical to your own struggle on the plains. Capital leverages land to extract infinite, uncompensated labor from the desperate working class. You are all caught in the exact same invisible web, separated by geography, but united by a shared, manufactured destitution. Whispers of organized resistance begin to filter through the isolated farming communities, carried by traveling organizers and cheaply printed populist newspapers passed hand to hand. Men gather in drafty barns and dimly lit schoolhouses after the exhausting day's work is done, their voices rising in anger against the railroads, the grain monopolies, and the gold standard. You attend one of these clandestine meetings, listening to a fiery speaker articulate the exact mechanisms of the invisible traps that have systematically destroyed your life and stolen your farm. The populist movement offers a radical, thrilling vision of collective power, demanding government regulation of freight rates, public ownership of infrastructure, and a financial system that prioritizes producers over Eastern speculators. You feel a sudden, dangerous spark of hope ignite in the dark room, the realization that your failure is not a personal moral failing, but the intended outcome of a rigged economy. You add your signature to the growing petition, knowing the railroads have the politicians bought, but desperately needing to fight back before the system grinds you completely into dust. You search the edges of the property during the grueling months of the spring-hungry gap, scanning the tree line for wild onions, dandelion greens, or anything remotely edible. The stored provisions have vanished entirely, leaving the family entirely dependent on the merchant's credit, which has been severely restricted by the landlord's recent instructions. You consider hunting for rabbits or wildfowl in the distant brush, but the new legal realities of tenancy mean the wildlife technically belongs to the property owner, transforming a desperate attempt to feed your starving children into an act of criminal poaching. You kneel in the dirt digging up bitter roots with a broken knife, your stomach cramping violently from the lack of solid, nutritious food. The sheer abundance of the American continent surrounds you, millions of acres of fertile land capable of feeding the world, yet you are legally prohibited from eating the flora and fauna that exist right outside your door. You carry the meager handful of weeds back to the cabin, the cruelest irony of agricultural capitalism echoing in your empty belly. Your hands shake slightly as you try to mend a broken leather harness by the dying light of the hearth fire, the physical toll of this life finally overwhelming your aging body. The joints in your fingers are swollen and stiff from years of gripping the plow handles in freezing rain and blistering heat, refusing to function with their former strength and precision. You look at your eldest son sleeping fitfully on the straw pallet, knowing with absolute horrifying certainty that you have absolutely no wealth, no property, and no inheritance to pass down to him. The generational trap has snapped shut. He will inherit only your status as a landless laborer, doomed to work someone else's fields until his own body breaks down in the exact same manner. You drop the leather strap into your lap and close your eyes, the profound, inescapable darkness of the frontier night pressing against the thin wooden walls of the rented cabin. You listen to the distant, mournful wail of the midnight train cutting through the freezing prairie darkness, the sound carrying the impossible, agonizing temptation of escape. The steel tracks lead back east or toward the rapidly industrializing cities, offering a phantom path away from the relentless misery of the agricultural trap. Your exhausted mind conjures vague, desperate images of massive brick factories and regular wage labor, wondering if trading rural starvation for urban anonymity might somehow save your remaining family. Leaving requires actual paper money for tickets, capital for a new start, and the legal freedom to walk away from the rented acreage without facing immediate prosecution. The grim reality is that your signature on the landlord's ledger completely binds you to this specific patch of dying dirt under threat of severe legal retaliation. Poverty has effectively tethered your feet to the floorboards of the cabin, making the distant horizon a taunting reminder of your absolute captivity. Contractual obligations in the sharecropping and tenant systems explicitly criminalize the act of a farmer abandoning a property before the harvest is fully gathered and the exorbitant debts are settled. The local sheriff frequently acts as the personal enforcement arm of the wealthy speculators, ready to hunt down fugitive debtors who attempt to slip away in the dead of night. You calculate the terrible mathematics of a hypothetical flight, knowing the landlord would legally confiscate your few remaining tools and the family would arrive in Chicago or St. Louis entirely destitute. Factory owners in the crowded manufacturing centers actively prefer immigrant labor over broken, independent-minded farmers, viewing rural refugees as unreliable and completely unskilled in the brutal rhythms of the assembly line. The terror of plunging your children into the squalid, disease-ridden tenements of the industrial slums paralyzes your ambition, forcing you to endure the familiar starvation of the plains over the unknown horrors of the urban underclass. You pull the heavy clay jug from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard near the cold iron stove, seeking the only accessible medication for this profound psychological trauma. The harsh, volatile scent of homemade corn whiskey immediately fills the cramped space, a sharp chemical odor that burns the inside of your nostrils and makes your eyes water. This raw alcohol represents a tiny fraction of the surplus regional harvest, converted illegally into liquid oblivion because the actual grain is worth virtually pennies on the flooded commodity market. You unscrew the wooden stopper and lift the heavy jug, feeling the rough, cold ceramic pressing hard against your cracked lips in the darkness. The liquor hits the back of your throat like liquid fire, a crude and violent shock that forcefully displaces the crushing, persistent anxiety radiating from the center of your chest. You drink heavily until the sharp edges of the room begin to blur, eagerly welcoming the artificial numbness that temporarily erases the merchant's ledger from your conscious mind. Despair fuels a massive, undocumented epidemic of alcoholism across the ruined agricultural communities of the American frontier during the hardest years of the late 19th century. Men who have systematically lost their land, their independence, and their basic ability to provide turn to the cheapest available narcotic to survive the crushing psychological weight of absolute failure. The corn that was originally intended to feed a growing nation and build generational wealth is instead distilled into a poison that systematically destroys the remaining fabric of vulnerable rural households. You watch your neighbors staggering down the muddy streets of the local railroad town, their faces flushed and vacant, their pockets emptied of the few copper coins that should have purchased essential flour. The temperance movement rallies in distant, comfortable cities, viewing this rural drunkenness as a sign of inherent moral decay, completely failing to understand that the drinking is a direct, tragic symptom of a predatory economic machine, a cold, calculated theft of human dignity. You wake to the sound of your wife weeping silently in the pre-dawn gloom, accompanied by the sharp, hacking cough of your youngest son echoing terribly in the damp cabin air. The chronic malnutrition that has hollowed out their bodies over the past 3 years now leaves them entirely defenseless against the opportunistic infections breeding in the unsanitary conditions of the frontier. You stumble out of the rough bedroll, your head still throbbing with the toxic residue of the cheap whiskey, overwhelmed by a sudden, sickening wave of guilt and utter uselessness. The child's forehead burns with an unnatural dry heat, his breathing shallow and rapid as his severely compromised immune system attempts to fight a losing battle against the encroaching pneumonia. You wet a ragged cloth in the freezing basin and press it against his feverish skin, knowing that real medicine is an impossible luxury strictly reserved for the merchant class and the railroad barons. The poverty enforced by the agricultural markets is not merely a financial status. It functions as a biological death sentence carried out in agonizing slow motion. You draw a bucket of water from the shallow well the next morning, the surface of the liquid swirling with a murky, highly suspect film that catches the pale sunlight. The intense multi-year drought has lowered the water table drastically, concentrating the harsh alkaline minerals and drawing unseen, deadly contaminants into the only available drinking source for miles. Boiling the water requires precious firewood that you simply cannot spare during the freezing months, forcing the family to consume the brackish liquid, raw, and risk the devastating consequences of waterborne pathogens. Typhoid and dysentery stalk the isolated farming communities with ruthless, mechanical efficiency, thriving in the compromised bodies of populations already severely weakened by months of forced single-crop diets. You hand a tin cup of the questionable water to your feverish child, trapped in a horrifying paradox where the absolute necessity of hydration is simultaneously the potential vector for a fatal infection. Survival is reduced to a grim daily game of biological roulette played against an indifferent and actively hostile landscape. Morning light fully illuminates the terrifying reality of a medical crisis unfolding without any hope of professional intervention or adequate medical supplies. The nearest trained physician operates a practice 15 miles away over deeply rutted dirt roads, demanding cash up front for a wagon journey he rarely makes to visit bankrupt tenant farmers. Your wife frantically attempts to brew medicinal tea from dried prairie herbs, relying on desperate, half-remembered folk remedies because the modern science of medicine is completely financially inaccessible to your class. You sit helplessly by the straw pallet, watching the infection ravage the small, fragile body, witnessing the cruelest manifestation of the systemic wealth extraction that has left your family so thoroughly defenseless. The federal government that enthusiastically subsidized the transcontinental railroads provides absolutely no public health infrastructure or emergency relief for the millions of citizens it lured onto the punishing plains. You are entirely alone with the dying, forced to bear the ultimate devastating cost of a capitalist experiment that values commodity production infinitely higher than human life. You carve a second rough wooden marker to place in the frozen earth behind the cabin, the physical act of burying another child permanently altering the fundamental architecture of your soul. The ground is bitterly unyielding in the dead of winter, requiring furious, exhausting strikes with the heavy iron spade just to open a space large enough for the small bundle wrapped in worn canvas. You understand now with perfect clarity that the staggering infant mortality rate on the frontier is not a natural tragedy, but a direct, entirely preventable consequence of engineered poverty and deliberate governmental neglect. Children born into wealthy, well-nourished urban households routinely survive these identical pathogens, their resilient bodies fortified by diverse diets and protected by modern municipal sanitation standards. You drive the wooden stake into the fresh earth, your vision blurred with a white-hot rage so profound it threatens to permanently shatter your mind. The system has taken your land, exploited your labor, devoured your future, and now it has systematically harvested your own bloodline. You step out onto the wooden porch the following week, instantly noticing an eerie, unbroken silence hanging heavily over the neighboring acreage across the dry creek bed. The battered wagon that usually sits beside the Johnson family's leaning barn is gone, and the heavy wooden door of their cabin swings listlessly on its iron hinges in the gathering winter wind. You walk across the invisible property line to investigate, finding the small house completely stripped of its meager furnishings and the livestock pens standing entirely empty. They have broken their tenancy contract in the dead of night, joining the invisible, desperate exodus of broken families fleeing the Great Plains in a frantic, uncoordinated search for basic survival. The sudden abandonment leaves behind a haunting tableau of absolute failure. A perfectly framed snapshot of the American agricultural collapse playing out in agonizing, silent, slow motion across millions of acres. You stand in their empty doorway, feeling the powerful, terrifying pull to load your own remaining possessions and vanish forever into the anonymity of the western horizon. Entire counties begin to hollow out as the relentless, grinding cycle of debt, drought, and untreatable disease finally breaks the collective will of the rural farming population. The frontier is rapidly depopulating by the early 1890s, returning to a state of wild desolation as thousands of homesteaders officially concede defeat and walk away from their deeply mortgaged dreams. You watch the empty timber cabins slowly succumb to the brutal elements, their roofs sagging dangerously under the weight of winter snows, their untreated wood bleaching to a ghostly gray under the punishing sun. The unplowed fields quickly surrender to the aggressive, deep-rooted native weeds, erasing the neat, geometric rows of cultivation that once represented the ultimate triumph of human ambition over the wilderness. You realize the grand national narrative of westward expansion is a carefully curated lie, masking a massive, tragic retreat of ordinary people who were chewed up and spat out by the machinery of industrial capital. The land remains, but the independent family farmers are being systematically and intentionally eradicated. You drive the oxen past the deserted homesteads on your unavoidable journey to town, the surrounding landscape taking on the depressing appearance of a vast, scattered graveyard of agricultural ambition. Wealthy Eastern speculators and massive landholding companies swoop in immediately to claim the abandoned properties at steep distress discounts, eagerly consolidating the ruined family farms into sprawling, corporate-owned estates. The desperate exodus of the poor perfectly serves the long-term financial interests of the wealthy, violently removing the stubborn, independent landowners and clearing the way for a highly capitalized model of modern agribusiness. You watch a team of hired wage-earning laborers tearing down a neighbor's old property fence, combining two smaller plots into a massive, uninterrupted field specifically designed for maximum mechanical efficiency. The very concept of the family farm is being actively dismantled right before your weary eyes, permanently replaced by a ruthless, profit-driven monoculture managed by distant executives who will never actually touch the soil. You grip the leather reins tighter, feeling like a living ghost haunting an economy that has already aggressively planned for your total extinction. You wrap your threadbare coat tighter against the biting wind, the crushing reality of your extreme isolation settling over you like a heavy, frozen blanket as the town comes into view. The main street feels significantly emptier today, the bustling, chaotic energy of the early settlement years entirely replaced by a grim, hollowed-out desperation among the few merchants and laborers who stubbornly remain. You tie the exhausted animals outside the general store, mentally preparing to beg for another meager advance of flour and salt to sustain your grieving, traumatized family through the bitterest part of the season. The storekeeper's heavy leather ledger is filled with the violently crossed-out names of men who fled in the night, shifting the entire financial burden of his extortionate profit margins onto the shoulders of the few trapped tenants who stayed. You push open the heavy wooden door, the small brass bell chiming with a harsh metallic finality that perfectly matches the bitter taste of total defeat lingering in your mouth. You step inside the dim room, ready to mortgage yet another year of your dwindling life to a financial system that explicitly and unapologetically desires your absolute failure. You accept the merchant's brutal new terms of credit in complete silence, listening to his flat, uncaring voice dictate the intentional restrictions placed on your family's survival rations. The distant landlord has formally instructed him to strictly limit the provisions for all remaining tenant farmers, ensuring that absolute hunger drives maximum productivity in the fields when the spring planting finally arrives. You offer no argument or resistance, the fight completely drained from your weary body by the staggering, unrelenting accumulation of personal tragedy and total economic ruin. You carry the insufficient canvas sacks back out to the waiting wagon, your neglected muscles screaming in violent protest against the simple, routine exertion of lifting the meager weight. The rapid physical deterioration of your own body perfectly mirrors the catastrophic collapse of the regional agricultural economy, a simultaneous breaking down of human flesh and financial capital under the relentless pressure of extraction. You climb onto the wooden seat, your hands entirely numb inside your worn leather gloves, preparing to navigate the frozen, deeply rutted dirt road back to the specific site of your family's ongoing destruction. Winter descends on the high plains with a violent, uncompromising ferocity, burying the abandoned neighboring farms and the ruined, exhausted fields beneath thick, suffocating drifts of brilliant white snow. The geographical isolation becomes terrifyingly absolute, sealing the surviving rural families inside their drafty cabins for weeks at a time with absolutely nothing to do but listen to the wind screaming across the flat earth. You sit motionless by the iron stove, watching the precious, carefully rationed firewood turn to gray ash, calculating precisely how many days of heat remain before the lethal cold finally breaches the thin wooden walls. Your wife mends the exact same torn garments over and over by the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, her silent endurance a profound testament to a staggering strength the official history books will never bother to record. The vast, unbroken silence of the snow-covered landscape feels like an enormous, heavy erasure, a pristine white sheet pulled slowly and deliberately over the massive, messy failure of the American agricultural experiment. You close your eyes and try desperately to remember the blinding, intoxicating optimism you felt on the exact day you originally filed the homestead claim at the government land office. The memory feels like it belongs to a completely different man, a naive, hopeful stranger who actually believed that backbreaking work and honest sweat could somehow overcome the entrenched institutional power of Eastern banks and railroad monopolies. You realize the ultimate, crowning triumph of the capitalist system is not merely the legal theft of your generated wealth, but the complete systematic destruction of your innate hope, leaving you with absolutely nothing but the grim mechanics of daily survival. The history of this brutal era will eventually be rewritten by the wealthy victors, painting the closing of the frontier as a glorious triumph of manifest destiny, while conveniently and permanently forgetting the starving children and the desperate, broken men. You open your eyes and stare deeply into the dying embers of the fire, fully comprehending that your immense, unparalleled suffering will be entirely erased from the national memory. You stand at the edge of the rented property as the bitter winter finally begins to break, staring out across an expanse of mud and dead grass that stretches unbroken toward the curvature of the earth. The sheer, overwhelming geographical scale of the Great Plains enforces a profound physical loneliness, a deep and terrifying isolation that slowly gnaws at the fragile edges of your sanity. Neighbors who once lived a few miles down the rutted dirt track have completely vanished, their foreclosed cabins standing as hollow, decaying monuments to the systematic failure of the agricultural dream. You listen to the relentless, howling wind sweeping across the flat terrain, a constant and abrasive noise that frays the nerves and underscores the absolute lack of any protective social infrastructure. The nearest doctor, the closest telegraph office, and the only source of emergency supplies all lie hours away behind a team of exhausted oxen, leaving your family entirely vulnerable to the slightest twist of cruel fate. Solitude falls heaviest upon the shoulders of the farm women, who are effectively imprisoned within the grim, unpainted walls of the homestead by the endless, brutal demands of 19th-century domestic labor. Your wife goes weeks or even months without hearing the voice of another adult woman, trapped in a relentless cycle of hauling water, mending worn canvas, and trying to stretch inadequate rations. There are no community gatherings, no social safety nets, and absolutely no mental health resources available to process the staggering, compounding trauma of losing children to preventable diseases and losing the land to distant bankers. She washes the coarse woolen garments by hand in freezing alkaline water, her knuckles raw and bleeding, her eyes fixed on the empty horizon with a quiet, terrifying despair that she refuses to articulate. The official histories will romanticize her as a stoic pioneer heroine, entirely ignoring the crushing, unrecognized depression that slowly hollows out her spirit over decades of unbroken, unrewarded sacrifice. Mud turns the meager roads into impassable, treacherous rivers of brown sludge as the spring thaw finally arrives, further cutting the struggling homestead off from the vital arteries of regional commerce. You inspect the crude root cellar beneath the floorboards, lifting the heavy wooden trapdoor with a profound sense of impending dread settling deep into your chronically empty stomach. The inadequate, hastily constructed storage facility has completely failed to protect the remaining winter provisions from the aggressive, fluctuating temperatures and the seeping ground moisture of the plains. You shine the dim light of a tallow candle into the dark, earthy cavity, illuminating a horrifying landscape of gray, fuzzy mold aggressively consuming the few remaining potatoes and the small cache of stored grain. The sheer lack of capital prevented you from purchasing the glass canning jars, the coarse salt, and the proper lumber necessary to build a secure, hygienic storage system, transforming your hard-won harvest into a toxic, rotting mass. Spoilage claims up to 40% of the food grown by independent farmers during this era, a staggering invisible tax levied directly against the most impoverished and vulnerable agricultural producers. You carefully scrape the worst of the toxic mold from a handful of soft sprouting root vegetables, knowing perfectly well that consuming this contaminated food carries severe, potentially lethal health risks. The financial reality dictates that throwing the rotting food away means absolute starvation, forcing the entire family to systematically ingest bacteria and fungal toxins simply to acquire the bare minimum calories required for survival. Chronic, low-grade infections and persistent digestive illnesses plague the household, directly caused by the desperate consumption of spoiled provisions that the merchant class would easily and immediately discard. The system ensures that the people who perform the agonizing labor of growing the nation's food are permanently relegated to eating its dangerous, decaying refuse. Late winter and early spring inaugurate the most terrifying phase of the agricultural calendar, a predictable, agonizing period of engineered starvation, universally known among the rural poor as the Hungry Gap. The meager stores from the previous autumn harvest have been completely exhausted or destroyed by rot, while the new spring crops have not yet even been planted in the frozen, unyielding earth. You watch the dwindling sack of merchant-supplied flour with an obsessive, panicked calculation, rationing the white powder by the spoonful to create a thin, watery broth that provides absolutely zero nutritional value. Children wake up crying from the deep, hollow ache in their bellies, their physical growth permanently stunted by these repeated, unavoidable cycles of severe, seasonal undernutrition. This is not a sudden, unpredictable famine caused by a dramatic natural disaster. It is a regular, scheduled period of mass deprivation, built directly into the core mechanics of the commercial cash crop economy. Ignorance regarding the complex science of human nutrition profoundly exacerbates the physical suffering of the farming class during these long, desperate months of restricted, monotonous diets. You notice your surviving children developing strange, terrifying symptoms. Their gums bleed sluggishly, their joints swell with painful fluid, and their fragile bones begin to bow under their own meager weight. Nobody in the isolated rural community understands that the lack of fresh vegetables and citrus is causing scurvy, or that the absence of dairy and sunlight is triggering severe cases of rickets. The prevailing medical wisdom of the 80s attributes these devastating ailments to bad humors, inherent moral weakness, or the vague, supposedly unhealthy air blowing off the untouched prairie grasses. The tragic reality is that the exact knowledge required to prevent these diseases is slowly emerging in distant, wealthy universities, but that vital information remains entirely inaccessible to the illiterate, exhausted farmers dying in the fields. You walk through the rented acreage as the planting season finally demands your labor, your body trembling with a profound, terrifying weakness born of 3 solid months of near-starvation rations. The cruelest irony of the agricultural cycle dictates that the most physically agonizing, energy-intensive work of the entire year must be performed precisely when the farmer is at his absolute weakest. You grip the heavy wooden handles of the iron plow, leaning your depleted body weight into the stubborn, muddy earth, fighting waves of dizzying nausea with every agonizing step forward. The soil must be turned and the seed must be sown on an exact, unforgiving schedule, requiring you to mortgage your own failing health just to ensure the landlord receives his mandated share of the autumn cash crop. You collapse to your knees at the end of a long furrow, gasping for breath, fully realizing that the system is literally converting your finite physical life force into agricultural commodities. Distant rumors drift across the plains regarding the massive organized land speculation schemes currently manipulating the regional real estate markets and driving the remaining independent farmers into utter destitution. Wealthy eastern syndicates intentionally purchase massive tracts of prime, fertile acreage along the newly laid railroad lines, deliberately withholding the land from cultivation to artificially inflate the surrounding property values. You watch these vast, empty fields sit idle year after year, completely unavailable to desperate settlers, serving absolutely no purpose other than acting as a speculative financial instrument for men who have never touched a plow. The artificial scarcity forces new arrivals to purchase marginal, unproductive land at exorbitant, inflated prices, ensuring they are hopelessly underwater on their mortgages before the first seed is even planted. The frontier has been transformed from a promised land of democratic opportunity into a rigged casino where the wealthy dictate the odds and the working class provides the necessary, disposable capital. Predatory lenders actively hunt for vulnerability, deliberately purchasing the distressed mortgages of struggling family farms at a steep discount just to immediately trigger the brutal, unforgiving foreclosure process. You hear the tragic story of a neighbor who missed a single, minor interest payment after a severe hailstorm destroyed his wheat, only to find his debt had been sold to a ruthless, distant holding company. The new corporate owners immediately called the note, violently dispossessing the family without a shred of human empathy or consideration for the decades of grueling labor they had invested in improving the property. These targeted foreclosures allowed the speculators to seize fully developed, productive farms for a mere fraction of their actual market value, quickly flipping the stolen assets to larger agribusiness conglomerates for a massive, unearned profit. The legal system protects these devastating financial maneuvers flawlessly, explicitly prioritizing the absolute sanctity of the signed contract over the basic biological survival of the American citizen. Shadows of the Southern sharecropping nightmare loom large over the increasingly desperate tenant farmers of the Midwest, revealing a unified national strategy of agricultural wealth extraction. Formerly enslaved black families and impoverished white laborers in the Cotton Belt are trapped in an identical, inescapable cycle of debt peonage, bound to the plantation commissaries by extortionate interest rates and rigged ledgers. You recognize the exact same economic mechanics operating in your own interactions with the local grain merchant. The landlord controls the inputs, dictates the crop, sets the prices, and performs the final, secret accounting. Southern state legislatures actually passed draconian labor laws making it a criminal offense for a sharecropper to abandon a contract while carrying a debt, literally resurrecting the absolute control of the slavery era under the thin, legalistic guise of free market capitalism. The regional differences blur into a single, horrifying reality. The people who work the earth have been permanently stripped of their agency, reduced to biological machines generating continuous profits for the owning class. You step into the freezing granary late one night, holding the flickering lantern high to inspect the heavy wooden bins that strictly belong to the man who holds the deed to your farm. The structure is packed to the rafters with thousands of bushels of golden wheat, a massive, tangible mountain of life-saving calories that you planted, nurtured, and harvested with your own bleeding hands. Your children are currently sleeping in the cabin mere yards away, their stomachs aching with genuine hollow hunger because the merchant's credit line has been completely severed. You reach out and let the smooth, hard kernels run through your calloused fingers, the sheer, staggering volume of the food mocking the brutal, engineered starvation of your own household. The legal system explicitly dictates that taking a single handful of this grain to feed your dying daughter constitutes criminal theft, a violation of property rights that would result in your immediate arrest and the total eviction of your family. You lower the lantern and step away from the overflowing bins, the bitter taste of total powerlessness flooding the back of your dry throat as you secure the heavy iron padlock on the door. The law clearly states that you must allow your own flesh and blood to starve to death before you dare to touch the financial collateral belonging to a distant, wealthy speculator. This is the absolute terrifying zenith of the agricultural paradox, the creation of massive, unprecedented abundance that simultaneously generates widespread, systemic malnutrition among the very people producing the wealth. You walk back toward the dark, freezing cabin under a canopy of bright and different stars, carrying the crushing knowledge that the system values the landlord's profit margins infinitely more than your children's lives. You push open the wooden door, stepping into the freezing shadows, preparing to endure another brutal night of the hungry gap while surrounded by a literal ocean of untouchable food. You watch the dawn pull the long shadows of the granary across the frost-hardened yard, the morning light offering no warmth to the exhausted homestead. Inside the cramped cabin, the relentless machinery of domestic labor has already begun its daily, unforgiving rotation long before the sun clears the horizon. Your wife stands over a battered iron basin, scrubbing the family's coarse wool garments against a ridged washboard until the freezing alkaline water turns a murky, chemical gray. Her hands are cracked and bleeding from the harsh soap, yet the legal framework of this newly industrialized nation considers her agonizing, essential work to be entirely without financial value. She possesses no right to own property, no voice in the catastrophic mortgages that ruined the farm, and no legal mechanism to protect her surviving children from your financial collapse. The agricultural economy fundamentally relies on her uncompensated physical destruction, while completely denying her any agency within the system she sustains. Smoke drifts lazily from the tin chimney pipe, carrying the sharp, acrid scent of burning, twisted prairie grass because the precious firewood reserves have finally been exhausted. Gathering this poor substitute for fuel requires miles of walking across the barren plains, adding hours of tedious physical exertion to a daily schedule already pushed past the limits of human endurance. The inside and outside spheres of farm work supposedly divide the labor evenly, but the crushing reality demands that women frequently abandon their domestic duties to labor alongside the men in the fields. During the desperate rush of the autumn harvest, she swings a heavy iron scythe with the exact same frantic energy as a hired hand, only to return to the cabin and begin the second shift of cooking and mending by candlelight. Her physical exhaustion is absolute, a bone-deep weariness that settles permanently into her spine, yet the official census ledgers will merely classify her as a dependent spouse. You notice a subtle, terrifying resignation settling over her features as she hangs the damp, heavy garments on a hemp line strung between the leaning barn and the house. If she ever attempted to flee this grueling, impoverished existence, the strict marital laws of the era would actually allow you to pursue her legally and force her immediate return through a mechanism called restitution. She is functionally trapped on this dying acreage by a combination of absolute financial destitution and a legal code that views her physical labor as a mandatory marital obligation. There is no independent savings account, no hidden stash of copper coins, and absolutely no sympathetic family members who could afford to shelter a runaway wife and her starving children. The vast, empty horizon that once symbolized boundless democratic freedom has effectively become the perimeter fence of an inescapable, socially sanctioned labor camp. She pins the last freezing shirt to the line, her breath pluming white in the frigid air, accepting a captivity that leaves no physical bruises but systematically breaks the human spirit. Lantern light flickers against the rough-hewn walls of the local schoolhouse miles away, illuminating the desperate, weather-beaten faces of men pushed completely to the brink of violent rebellion. The populist organizers have arrived from the cities armed with cheaply printed pamphlets and a fiery, articulate outrage that perfectly diagnoses the systemic extortion suffocating the rural working class. A man in a frayed broadcloth suit stands behind the teacher's wooden desk, passionately explaining how the Eastern banks and the railroad monopolies deliberately engineered the catastrophic deflation of global wheat prices. He speaks of government ownership of the telegraph lines, the desperate need for a silver standard to expand the money supply, and the creation of federal sub-treasuries to provide low-interest credit directly to producers. The rhetoric is intoxicating, a sudden, brilliant flash of political clarity that finally shifts the blame away from individual moral failure and places it squarely on the shoulders of unchecked corporate capitalism. You sit on a small wooden bench at the back of the crowded room, feeling a dangerous, unfamiliar surge of collective power rising in your chest as the speaker outlines the path to agrarian liberation. The men around you murmur in aggressive, unified agreement, their calloused hands gripping the brims of their dusty hats, ready to cast their ballots for a third political party that actually represents the blood and sweat of the producer. For a few thrilling hours, the terrifying isolation of the prairie is completely shattered by the realization that millions of other tenant farmers are suffering under the exact same rigged economic machinery. You sign the circulating petition with a trembling hand, believing that the sheer, overwhelming numerical majority of the working class must eventually overwhelm the concentrated, localized wealth of the railroad barons. You ride the wagon back to the homestead under the moonlight, carrying a fragile, glowing coal of optimism that the federal government might actually intervene and save the heartland from total corporate annexation. Mainstream politicians in the distant marble halls of Washington view this agrarian uprising not as a legitimate cry for economic justice, but as a dangerous, radical threat to the fundamental order of free market capitalism. The massive, well-funded lobbying arms of the railroad monopolies immediately deploy their vast resources, purchasing influence and aggressively campaigning against any proposed regulation of freight rates or banking practices. Judges consistently strike down the few state-level attempts to cap transportation costs, ruling that corporate property rights completely supersede the economic survival of the citizens dependent on those vital steel arteries. The laissez-faire ideology proves entirely impenetrable, a rigid, dogmatic belief system that actively prefers mass starvation over the slightest governmental interference in the sacred, self-correcting mechanisms of the market. The fiery populist movement eventually fractures, absorbed and diluted by the established political machine, leaving the fundamental structure of agricultural exploitation completely intact and stronger than ever. You observe the neighbor's wagon rolling slowly past your property line weeks later, piled high with a pathetic, chaotic assortment of battered furniture, rusted tools, and threadbare bedding. The populist political defeat has extinguished the very last embers of hope in the county, triggering a massive, irreversible exodus of broken families who can no longer survive the mathematical impossibility of tenant farming. They are heading toward the distant rail depot, intending to abandon the rural landscape entirely and seek waged employment in the dark, notoriously dangerous factories of the expanding industrial cities. You raise a hand in a silent, solemn farewell, knowing that they possess absolutely no urban skills, no industrial training, and no financial cushion to navigate the squalid, overcrowded tenements waiting for them at the end of the line. The dream of the independent pioneer has officially mutated into the nightmare of the disposable, unskilled urban laborer, trading the open-air starvation of the plains for the suffocating, soot-stained poverty of the slums. Abandoned properties dot the sprawling Kansas landscape like decaying teeth, their unpainted timber frames slowly buckling under the relentless pressure of the high prairie winds. The massive, well-capitalized land syndicates immediately swoop in to consolidate these fractured, ruined homesteads, erasing the invisible property lines to create sprawling, hyper-efficient corporate farms worked entirely by seasonal, landless employees. The diverse, vibrant communities that the Homestead Act originally intended to build have been systematically eradicated, replaced by a cold industrial agricultural model optimized solely for maximum commodity extraction. Schools closed due to lack of students, local merchants board up their windows as their customer base vanishes, and the vibrant social fabric of the rural frontier unravels into a bleak, depopulated silence. The transition from a nation of independent producers to a nation of corporate employees is physically mapped onto the dying dirt of the Great Plains, a permanent, tragic geographic restructuring. You grip the rough wooden handle of the hoe, staring out across the vast, empty fields that once held the chaotic, hopeful energy of a dozen different struggling families. The psychological burden of remaining behind while everyone else flees is uniquely agonizing, an isolating mixture of stubborn, irrational pride and the terrifying knowledge that you literally cannot afford the train tickets to escape. You are functionally marooned on this rented acreage, bound by the landlord's ledger and forced to witness the slow, agonizing death of your own community from the front porch of a decaying cabin. Every stroke of the iron blade against the dry earth feels incredibly futile, a mechanical, thoughtless motion performed merely to satisfy the contractual obligations of a system you now recognize as entirely fraudulent. You lower your head and continue hacking at the stubborn weeds, understanding that your physical survival now depends on completely detaching your mind from the horrifying reality of your own circumstances. Thunderheads gather on the western horizon late in the afternoon, massive, bruised columns of purple and black clouds that promise violence rather than salvation. The climate of the plains remains spectacularly indifferent to the economic and political tragedies unfolding across its surface, delivering torrential, destructive downpours that wash away the precious topsoil just as the remaining crops begin to sprout. Lightning fractures the darkening sky, illuminating the stark, lonely silhouette of your cabin against the vast, terrifying emptiness of the surrounding prairie. This unforgiving environment requires massive investments in irrigation, robust infrastructure, and cooperative community support to successfully farm, yet the government merely handed out raw acreage and abandoned the settlers to the absolute mercy of the elements. The impending storm feels like a final, physical insult from a landscape that was never truly meant to support this dense, aggressive style of commercial monoculture. You rush to secure the heavy wooden shutters as the first fat, freezing drops of rain begin to strike the packed dirt of the yard with the force of thrown pebbles. The wind howls around the corners of the small house, finding every crack and crevice in the shoddy construction, driving a fine, abrasive mist into the cramped, dark living space. You huddle with your family near the cold iron stove, listening to the terrifying, percussive roar of hail beginning to batter the fragile, shingled roof above your heads. Every strike represents another lost stalk of corn, another fraction of a penny subtracted from the autumn harvest, and another day added to the inevitable, impending cycle of the hungry gap. You wrap your arm around your trembling wife in the darkness, the deafening noise of the storm completely drowning out the unspoken, shared realization that you are fundamentally, hopelessly trapped. Generations later, the sheer, staggering scale of this late 19th century agricultural catastrophe will be almost entirely erased from the collective, popular memory of the American public. The brutal reality of starving children sitting inside overflowing granaries, the epidemic of rural suicides, and the ruthless corporate consolidation of the heartland will fade into obscurity, replaced by a sanitized, triumphant mythology of brave pioneers conquering the wild frontier. History books will enthusiastically celebrate the mechanical reaper and the transcontinental railroad, entirely ignoring the millions of broken, indebted families whose unpaid labor actually financed that rapid industrial expansion. Acknowledging the profound, systemic failure of the Homestead Act requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that unregulated capitalism is perfectly capable of destroying entire communities in the pursuit of concentrated wealth. The nation chooses to remember the myth of the independent, successful farmer because the actual reality of engineered, inescapable poverty is far too damning to incorporate into the national identity. You step out into the muddy yard the next morning, the storm having passed, leaving behind a battered, waterlogged landscape that smells sharply of bruised vegetation and wet clay. The hailstones have shredded the young corn leaves, reducing the vibrant green rows to a ragged, pathetic tangle of broken stalks that will never fully recover their maximum yield potential. You calculate the new, devastating losses in your head, the mental ledger automatically adding this natural disaster to the compounding interest, the exorbitant railroad freight rates, and the punishing landlord's share. There is no insurance, no disaster relief fund, and no sympathetic banker willing to forgive a debt because the sky decided to release its fury over your specific coordinates. You reach down and pull a ruined, muddy stalk from the earth, the physical evidence of your ongoing destruction cold and heavy in your calloused hand. You drop the ruined stalk back into the muddy earth, watching it sink slightly into the soft, abrasive sludge that has replaced your topsoil. The storm has washed away the last lingering illusion that sheer human effort can somehow conquer the spectacular, indifferent geographical expanse. You stand completely still in the center of the field, listening to the runoff water rushing angrily through the freshly carved gullies that now scar your rented acreage. The realization of total defeat does not arrive with a dramatic, thunderous epiphany, but rather as a quiet, heavy settling of cold exhaustion in your chest. You know exactly what must happen next, because you have watched dozens of other desperate men make the identical, agonizing calculation over the past 3 years. The great American agricultural experiment has finally broken you, demanding a surrender that leaves no room for pride or pioneer mythology. Morning light reveals a landscape fundamentally altered by the violence of the hail, stripping away the vibrant greens and leaving behind a bruised, battered gray. The silence that follows the storm feels incredibly oppressive, an absolute absence of the usual rustling corn that traditionally signifies life and future security on the plains. You walk slowly toward the leaning barn, your boots sinking deep into the muck, every step requiring a deliberate, exhausting expenditure of physical energy. You must begin the terrifying process of inventorying your few remaining possessions, deciding exactly what can be carried in a single wagon and what must be permanently abandoned to the elements. The wooden tools, the heavy iron implements, and the crude furniture you built by hand represent thousands of hours of unpaid labor that you are now forced to simply walk away from. The physical destruction of the property perfectly mirrors the absolute financial ruin sitting heavily in the merchant's ledger back in town. You watch your wife receive the news of the impending departure with a quiet, devastating stoicism that speaks volumes about the chronic trauma she has already endured. She immediately begins packing the meager household goods into worn canvas sacks, her movements tight and efficient, refusing to shed a single tear over the loss of a cabin that has seen so much starvation and death. The children observe her with wide, hollow eyes, sensing the profound atmospheric shift in the household, but lacking the vocabulary to understand the massive geographical displacement that is about to occur. You notice how incredibly small their bodies look in their frayed, patched clothing, a direct physical testament to the years of engineered malnutrition dictated by the merchant's ledger. They will carry the biological scars of this agricultural catastrophe in their bones for the rest of their lives, their physical growth permanently stunted by the relentless cycles of the hungry gap. You turn away from the heartbreaking sight, unable to bear the overwhelming guilt of a father who followed a national lie directly into absolute destitution. Dust begins to rise from the rutted road days later as the mud finally dries, creating a fine, abrasive powder that coats the entire wagon in a pale, ghostly film. The final leather strap is secured tightly over the canvas tarp, binding the pathetic remnants of your earthly wealth into a single, highly vulnerable pile. The oxen stand patiently in their heavy wooden yokes, their heads lowered against the constant scouring wind that never truly stops blowing across the flat expanse of the prairie. You take one last long look at the unpainted timber cabin, the empty livestock pens, and the small, unmarked mounds of earth behind the tree line where your children are buried. The psychological weight of leaving those graves behind threatens to completely crush your spirit, forcing you to sever the deepest, most painful emotional anchors a human being can possess. You click your tongue and crack the worn leather reins, setting the heavy wooden wheels into slow, groaning motion away from the dying homestead. You guide the exhausted team past the boundaries of your former acreage, joining a scattered, tragic procession of other ruined families moving slowly toward the distant rail depot. The trail is littered with the heavy, discarded debris of the Exodus, including broken chairs, rusted plows, and cracked iron stoves that proved far too heavy to transport across the sprawling continent. You watch a neighboring farmer walking listlessly beside his own overloaded wagon, his face hollowed out by despair, his eyes fixed firmly on the dirt road directly in front of his boots. Nobody speaks of the future, because the future is a terrifying, formless void, completely devoid of the familiar agricultural rhythms that have defined their entire existence. The shared silence of the retreating column is profound, a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that the promise of the western frontier was a carefully constructed, fatal illusion. You grip the reins tighter, focusing entirely on the mechanical repetition of placing one foot in front of the other. Shadows stretch incredibly long across the dying plains as you approach the ragged edges of the local railroad town, the wooden buildings looking small and incredibly fragile against the vast horizon. The settlement has been practically hollowed out by the massive agricultural collapse, its mercantile economy completely destroyed by the sudden evaporation of its indebted rural customer base. You see the general store where you signed away your future, its front windows boarded up with rough timber, the exploitive merchant having already fled to greener, more profitable pastures. The grain elevator stands completely empty, a towering silent monument to the extractive machinery of the eastern monopolies that successfully devoured the wealth of the region. The town is dying right alongside the farms, a symbiotic collapse that perfectly illustrates the fragile, interconnected nature of frontier capitalism. You stand in a long, winding line at the ticket window, clutching the few crumpled dollars you manage to salvage from the sale of your remaining livestock at severe distressed prices. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, burning coal, and the sharp, sour tang of pervasive human anxiety. You exchange your meager cash for thin slips of printed paper, legally trading your status as an independent agricultural producer for the terrifying anonymity of the urban industrial workforce. The railroad company, which previously extorted you for freight rates, now gladly extracts your final pennies to transport your broken family away from the wasteland they actively helped create. You fold the tickets carefully into the inner pocket of your worn coat, feeling the absolute terrifying finality of the transaction settling into the pit of your stomach. You walk back to the crowded platform, gathering your wife and children close as the massive iron train finally hisses and shudders to a violent halt. Inside the stifling, overcrowded train car, the atmosphere is suffocatingly dense with the collective, unspoken trauma of dozens of dispossessed farming families packed tightly onto hard wooden benches. The physical proximity of so many desperate strangers feels incredibly foreign and alarming after years of experiencing the profound, unbroken isolation of the rural frontier. The locomotive lurches forward with a massive, metallic crash, throwing you violently back into the hard seat as the train begins to aggressively gather speed along the steel tracks. You stare out the dirty, soot-stained window, watching the endless flat expanse of the Great Plains blur into a monotonous gray ribbon of dead grass and abandoned homesteads. The geographical distance separating you from the graves of your children increases with every passing second, a physical tearing of the heart that leaves you gasping for breath in the cramped carriage. You close your eyes, desperately trying to block out the rhythmic, mechanical clacking of the wheels that seems to aggressively mock your absolute failure. You realize with a sickening clarity that the destination printed on your ticket offers absolutely no guarantee of salvation, merely a lateral transition from rural starvation to urban exploitation. The massive, soot-choked industrial cities of the East and Midwest are already overflowing with desperate immigrants and displaced laborers fighting viciously for starvation wages in highly dangerous factories. You possess no mechanical skills, no understanding of the brutal, rigid discipline of the assembly line, and absolutely no social connections within the dark, crowded tenement districts. The system has successfully transformed you from a landowning pioneer into a completely disposable unit of raw physical labor, entirely stripped of the dignity and independence that originally drove you westward. You hold your wife's trembling hand in the dim rocking carriage, fully comprehending that the absolute worst of your struggles might actually still lie ahead in the concrete canyons of the city. Distant lights begin to pierce the darkness outside the window days later, a sprawling, glowing constellation of gas lamps and factory fires that clearly signals your arrival at the industrial metropolis. The sheer scale and noise of the city are completely overwhelming, a chaotic mechanical roar that violently assaults senses previously attuned to the profound, unbroken silence of the open prairie. You step off the train onto the crowded, filthy concrete platform, instantly swallowed by a surging sea of humanity that moves with a frantic, aggressive urgency you have never experienced. The air tastes heavily of coal smoke, raw sewage, and burning chemicals, coating the back of your throat with a dark, bitter residue that feels like a physical violation. You gather your terrified family close, lifting the heavy canvas sacks onto your aching shoulders, stepping blindly into the terrifying, alien landscape of the American urban nightmare. The frontier has officially closed behind you, permanently locking the heavy iron gates on the agrarian dream. You find temporary shelter in a crumbling, multi-story tenement building packed deep within the poorest, most neglected ward of the sprawling city, navigating a dark and highly dangerous labyrinth of poverty. The tiny, windowless room you rent smells of damp plaster and decades of unwashed humanity, offering a suffocating, claustrophobic contrast to the vast, open skies you recently abandoned. You pay the demanding, unsympathetic landlord a week's rent in advance, watching your remaining cash reserves dwindle to a terrifying, unsustainable fraction of what is required to simply survive the month. The sheer, overwhelming density of the urban population ensures that highly contagious diseases like tuberculosis and cholera spread through the cramped hallways with a ruthless, terrifying efficiency. You lock the flimsy wooden door behind you, realizing that you have merely traded the open-air isolation of the plains for the dangerous, disease-ridden anonymity of the industrial underclass. You join the desperate, surging crowd of men gathered outside the heavy iron gates of the local manufacturing plant the next morning, begging for a chance to sell your sheer physical labor. The factory foreman walks the line with a cold, calculating eye, entirely dismissing the older, weather-beaten farmers in favor of younger, stronger immigrants who can endure the brutal pace of the machines. You stand in the freezing rain for hours, your pride completely shattered, offering your calloused hands and your exhausted body to a corporate entity that views you as entirely replaceable machinery. When you are finally selected for a grueling 12-hour shift hauling raw materials, you accept the starvation wages without a single word of protest, terrorized by the thought of returning to the tenement empty-handed. You surrender your remaining independence to the piercing shriek of the factory whistle, fully absorbed into the lowest, darkest tier of the capitalist hierarchy. You work until your muscles burn and your lungs ache with the deep inhalation of toxic, airborne particulates, the rhythmic, deafening crashing of the massive steel presses drowning out all conscious thought. The relentless mechanized pace of the factory floor allows absolutely no room for the natural, seasonal rhythms that once comfortably governed your entire existence on the isolated prairie homestead. You are closely monitored by aggressive, unforgiving floor managers who actively dock your miserable pay for the slightest infraction, enforcing a brutal discipline that heavily mirrors the absolute control of the agricultural landlords. The wealth you generate through your agonizing, dangerous physical exertion is immediately funneled upward to the exact same class of wealthy speculators and bankers who originally foreclosed on your farm. You realize the entire American economic system is a perfectly closed loop of extraction, designed specifically to systematically drain the life force from the working class regardless of their geographic location. Years bleed together into a gray, monotonous blur of grueling factory shifts, crowded tenement living, and a quiet, desperate struggle just to keep adequate food on the small wooden table. The powerful memory of the vast golden wheat fields and the clean smell of the turned prairie earth slowly begins to fade, replaced entirely by the immediate, crushing realities of the industrial slums. You watch your children grow up in the narrow, garbage-strewn alleys, their pale faces never fully exposed to the harsh, brilliant sunlight that once defined your own youth on the frontier. They have no concept of the independent agrarian dream that nearly destroyed you, completely accepting their status as urban wage laborers as the natural, immutable order of the modern world. You sit by the small, dirty window of the apartment late at night, coughing the black soot from your lungs, the profound, unacknowledged trauma of your violent displacement buried deep beneath layers of necessary survival. You witness the slow, intentional erasure of your own lived history from the popular national narrative as the 20th century begins to aggressively assert its modernized, highly industrialized identity. The newspapers and politicians celebrate the glorious, successful settling of the West, painting a completely fraudulent picture of prosperous, independent farmers enthusiastically feeding a rapidly growing, muscular nation. The millions of broken, indebted families who were chewed up by the commodity markets, the railroad monopolies, and the predatory lenders are entirely scrubbed from the official, sanitized historical record. You listen to the patriotic speeches on national holidays, the bitter taste of truth sharp in your mouth, knowing that the foundation of this immense corporate wealth was built directly on the unmarked graves of your own children. The ultimate tragedy is not just that the agricultural system destroyed you, but that the architects of that destruction successfully convinced the world it was actually a glorious, unmitigated victory. You close your exhausted eyes and let the relentless, chaotic noise of the city wash over you, surrendering completely to the historical amnesia that now covers the nation like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the injustice is simply too massive to fight, requiring a level of collective, coordinated resistance that was permanently shattered when the populist movement collapsed back on the plains. You understand that future generations will likely repeat the exact same tragic mistakes, blindly trusting the rigged systems of capital because the true, horrifying cost of the frontier experiment has been deliberately and carefully forgotten. The invisible traps of debt, monopoly, and uncompensated labor will merely shift their forms, continuing to extract the vital wealth from the producers while wrapping the theft in the comforting language of free market opportunity. You drift into a restless, troubled sleep, a forgotten ghost of the American plains permanently trapped within the dark, unforgiving machinery of the modern industrial age. You watch the years slip away like dry topsoil carried off by the relentless prairie wind, the immediate, agonizing trauma of the 1890 Sugny slowly fading into the distance. The survivors of the great agricultural collapse eventually find ways to endure, either by capitulating entirely to the tenant system or by fleeing to the sprawling, anonymous industrial cities. You age alongside the century, your body bearing the permanent physical scars of chronic malnutrition and the punishing, bone-deep exhaustion of unrewarded frontier labor. The children who manage to survive the typhoid and the hungry gaps grow into hardened adults, carrying the silent, inherited trauma of a childhood defined by engineered starvation. You realize that the raw, immediate anger of the populist movement has been entirely extinguished, replaced by a quiet, pervasive resignation that settles heavily over the remaining rural population. The 20th century arrives with the mechanical roar of tractors and the aggressive expansion of corporate agribusiness, permanently closing the book on the dream of the independent family homestead. Decades pass with an indifferent, sweeping momentum that systematically erases the specific, localized tragedies of the ruined generation from the collective national consciousness. The truth is buried. The official history books are written by the wealthy victors in the comfortable, prosperous cities of the East, men who have absolutely no interest in documenting the systemic extortion of the rural working class. They enthusiastically craft a triumphant, sanitized mythology of brave, stoic pioneers conquering the untamed wilderness with nothing but a plow and a Bible. This manufactured narrative deliberately ignores the devastating reality of the exorbitant railroad freight rates, the usurious banking monopolies, and the widespread intentional starvation of the people producing the nation's wealth. The complex, predatory economic machinery that actually defined the era is completely smoothed over, replaced by a simple, comforting fable of rugged American individualism and manifest destiny. You listen to these polished, heroic tales being taught to your grandchildren, a bitter, silent incredulity tightening your chest as the truth of your own life is systematically overwritten. The actual lived experience of watching a child die from preventable scurvy while surrounded by a literal mountain of mortgaged wheat is deemed far too dark and complicated for the public curriculum. You understand that remembering the profound, catastrophic failure of the free market system is deeply uncomfortable for a nation desperately trying to project an image of boundless democratic opportunity. The painful, messy reality of your extreme poverty is actively suppressed because acknowledging it would require admitting that the American economic machine is perfectly capable of destroying its own citizens for profit. You keep the brutal memories locked safely behind your teeth, knowing that the newly established romanticized mythology has already won the battle for the historical record. You witness the physical evidence of the massive, tragic agricultural retreat slowly disappearing from the surface of the Great Plains, reclaimed by the aggressive native grasses and the relentless grinding weather. The unpainted timber cabins that once housed desperate, starving families collapse into piles of rotting, gray lumber, eventually sinking entirely into the dark, unforgiving earth. Broken plowshares and rusted iron wagon wheels are occasionally turned up by the massive diesel-powered machinery of the new corporate farms, functioning as the only silent, remaining artifacts of a completely destroyed civilization. The vast, uninterrupted fields of modern, industrial monoculture offer absolutely no visual hint of the chaotic, desperate patchwork of independent homesteads that preceded them. The landscape itself becomes complicit in the great forgetting, completely absorbing the blood, sweat, and failure of millions of people without leaving a single permanent monument to their suffering. You realize that as the nation becomes increasingly urbanized, the specific, agonizing mechanics of agricultural exploitation become entirely irrelevant to the daily lives of the vast majority of the population. The connection is severed. The descendants of the broken farmers now work in offices and factories, purchasing their processed food from brightly lit grocery stores without ever considering the brutal economic realities of its production. You watch the physical distance between the consumer and the producer expand into an insurmountable psychological chasm, guaranteeing that the systemic abuses of the past will remain safely hidden from the modern conscience. The profound, desperate struggles of the 80s are reduced to quaint, sepia-toned photographs and brief, romanticized footnotes in the grand, sweeping narrative of continuous American progress. You feel the absolute, terrifying finality of this cultural amnesia, understanding that when a society completely forgets the devastating failures of its economic systems, it inevitably guarantees their eventual, tragic repetition. Contemporary agricultural systems continue to operate on the exact same fundamental architecture of extraction and consolidation that originally ruined the 19th-century homesteaders. Modern farmers are similarly trapped by the crushing weight of massive, unpayable debt, heavily mortgaged to powerful, centralized banks to afford the multi-million-dollar machinery required to compete in the global market. They remain entirely vulnerable to the aggressive, unpredictable swings of international commodity prices, forced to sell their immense harvests to a handful of monopolistic processing corporations that dictate the terms of survival. The specialized, chemical-dependent monoculture still depletes the earth, while the profits generated by the rural working class continue to flow steadily upward into the distant, unseen hands of the financial elite, a perfect, unbroken circle. The specific, technological forms of the trap have evolved into something sleek and modern, but the underlying, ruthless mechanics of debt peonage remain completely intact and operational. You step away from the historical ledgers and the bitter memories of the foreclosed farms, allowing the heavy, suffocating weight of the 19th century to finally begin sliding off your weary shoulders. The story we have traced together is profoundly dark, built entirely upon the quiet, unrecorded desperation of ordinary people who were systematically crushed by economic forces vastly larger than themselves. You recognize that holding this heavy, tragic truth requires a specific kind of emotional endurance, a willingness to witness the painful reality hidden carefully behind the triumphant, patriotic mythology. You have walked alongside the ghosts of the dispossessed, honoring their agonizing struggles and acknowledging the devastating, engineered poverty they were forced to endure in complete, absolute isolation. You take a slow, deep breath, feeling the tension of the merchant's ledger and the banker's mortgage, slowly releasing its tight, paralyzing grip on your own chest. Calmness begins to settle over the immediate physical space around you, a sharp, welcoming contrast to the relentless, freezing winds and the terrifying, empty horizons of the Great Plains. The danger is gone. The room you occupy is safe, warm, and entirely disconnected from the brutal, unforgiving agricultural mathematics that dictated the harsh, truncated lives of the forgotten pioneers. You allow the vivid, distressing images of the ruined wheat fields and the starving children to gently dissolve into the background, retreating back into the closed, silent pages of the historical archive. The profound, systemic injustices of the past cannot reach you here, their power completely neutralized by the vast, protective expanse of time that separates your current reality from their enduring tragedy. The ambient sounds of your own modern environment return to the forefront of your awareness, grounding you firmly in a present moment defined by peace and security. You let your breathing slow to a deep, steady, rhythmic pace, signaling to your body that the arduous, exhausting journey through the dark machinery of the American frontier is officially over. You release the residual, lingering anxiety associated with the locust swarms, the hailstorms, and the crushing, inescapable cycles of the Hungry Gap, letting it all drain away into the floorboards beneath you. You focus on the physical sensation of the comfortable surface supporting your weight, a profound, luxurious comfort that the exhausted, malnourished women of the 1880s could never possibly have imagined. You feel the muscles in your jaw, your neck, and your lower back completely relaxing, surrendering the defensive, rigid posture required to survive the relentless, grinding hostility of the historical narrative. You are entirely safe to let your guard down, to relinquish control, and to allow the natural healing process of restorative sleep to gently wash over your tired mind. Darkness behind your closed eyelids is no longer the terrifying, freezing blackness of an isolated, bankrupt cabin, but a soft, welcoming blanket of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. The ghosts of the Great Plains have been heard, their tragic, unwritten stories finally acknowledged, allowing them to rest quietly in the deep, undisturbed shadows of the past where they truly belong. You drift away from the conscious world of debts, contracts, and survival, sinking effortlessly into a profound, heavy slumber that demands absolutely nothing of you in return. The night holds no threats, the morning promises no agonizing labor, and the relentless, churning machinery of history is temporarily paused for your benefit. You close your eyes. Rest well tonight. I'll be here when you're ready for another quiet story.